D Now is next week. So, yeah, it's a great week. If you have kids or grandkids that are still interested in participating in D Now, I am told that they can sign up to 11:59 tonight. But it is a great week. In fact, Ergen Canner will be teaching throughout that week. And Ergen's a wonderful guy, and he's actually going to be preaching next week too. And so you're going to get a Middle Eastern perspective on the second half of John chapter 2, which is going to be a lot of fun to hear him talk about and explain what was going on in the temple. And so you don't want to miss that. And then I'm going to have some surgery, and I'm going to be out of the pulpit for a couple of weeks after that. But as usual, you're going to be in wonderful hands. And so be praying about this coming weekend. This is a formative time in the life of youth. Often it can be very catalytic. And it's also a time where they build community. And if you're a parent or grandparent, you know how essential that is in the life of kiddos. So we'll pray with me again. Jesus, you are extraordinary. And that just sounds silly almost because of how magnificent you are. With every breath we have, another breath to be thankful for. With every step we have, another step to be thankful for. Just to imagine how you put the human body together, how you place the stars in the sky. God of thunderstorms and waterfalls. Boy, bring us to a place of awe this morning. Bring us to a place of awe. In your precious and your holy name, amen. Well, I know you know this, that what we believe matters, right? What we believe matters. And if you believe the economy is in a downturn, then you may not invest as much into your retirement right now as you normally would. If you believe your children's education is important, then you may not go buy that recreational vehicle that you would really like to have. You don't want to be put behind the 8 ball if something comes up. If you believe that spending time with your children is vital, then maybe you think twice about taking that job that has you out of the house so much. Or if you believe a college degree matters, maybe instead of spending so much time partying, you actually are studying, right? But what you believe matters. But even more important than what you believe is that what you believe is revealed in your time of need. Like what you truly believe is revealed when the pressure is on, when crisis takes place, when you have a legitimate need. And what we've learned is that times of pressure not only reveal who we are, but they reveal where we go for comfort, where we look for security, where our hopes are actually set. Again, what we truly believe is revealed in times of need. Well, we started the book of John back in November, and we've been walking through that really cautiously and slowly and with a lot of joy and celebration. And then we took a break during Christmas, rightfully so, and we're going to be back in the book of John. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to John chapter 2 this morning. And we're going to continue kind of on that rhythm. We're going to be in John, then we may take a break here and there and be back in John. But I promise you, we're going to work through John, and by 2030, we'll probably be done with it. And but it's an incredible book. And let me just recap, because it's been a little bit since we were there, but John chapter 1, a magnificent chapter, talks about the coming of Jesus. Now, it doesn't cover his birth like we've been celebrating the last month, but it talks about the coming of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him, and without him not anything was made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I mean, that's a great way to start a book off, right? That's a great way to start a coming of the Lord. And he came, and in fact, it goes on to say, not only, when it's talking about the Word being Jesus, not only did he come in power, not only did he come as creator, not only was he the light in the life of all men in such a way that darkness can't overcome it, but in the way he came to earth. And in verse 14 it says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word became flesh. Jesus became flesh. Divine became flesh. Essentially what it means is that Jesus put on humanity. He didn't stop being God. In fact, he's still fully God. He was also fully man. And it says that he dwelt. That word is the word tabernacle. It essentially means that he put up residence. He came to your neighborhood and he started living among you. You want to talk about hospitality? You want to talk about the host of creation? He has come back to his creation and he is hosting you in his world. And it also says this, that we have seen his glory as of the Son from the Father. So everything that we see of Jesus and his expressions is also, when we see those same expressions, it's expressions of God. And he goes on, and he says, we have seen his glory as of the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so when Jesus came, he came with that hand of conviction, but also with that hand of comfort. It's not an either or. It's not 60% grace and 40% truth. It's 100% both. That he came to rule and he came to redeem. And that's a beautiful thing. Well, we see the coming of Jesus, but we also see the calling of Jesus later on in chapter 1. We see where he is starting his earthly ministry and he's baptized by his cousin John the Baptist. And following the coming and the calling, we see this invitation that he makes to the disciples. Or to these men who become disciples. And it says, hey, come and follow me. Come and walk with me. In fact, when we talk about disciples here at Lake Church, and when the Bible talks about disciples here at Lake Church, there's kind of three pictures that we have of a disciple. One who abides in Jesus. A disciple abides in Jesus. A disciple says, listen, I'm done with my way of thinking, my way of living. I'm going to surrender my life. I'm going to abide in you, Jesus. It's also a disciple is being changed by Jesus. A disciple recognizes that, man, this is not all that we are, that Jesus has something better for us. He wants us to change, and so we submit ourselves under his authority, whether that be his personhood, his church, his word. He begins to change us and shape us and mold us. Why? Because he wants to bring us more intimately in relationship with him. He wants us to experience his joy, his satisfaction, his fullness. And that last thing about a disciple is on mission with Jesus and his church. I love the Apostle Paul talked about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He said, when the old life is gone and the new life is put on, then you become an ambassador of reconciliation. Man, that's crazy that Jesus, the creator of the universe, the God who rules and reigns and redeems, he's like, hey, why don't you come partner with me and let's redeem the world? I mean, that sounds exciting to me, right? Like that ought to sound exciting to you. And so a disciple is one who abides in Jesus, is being changed by Jesus, and on mission with Jesus and his church. Well, that was just chapter 1. That's why it took like a month and a half to get through it. But we're in chapter 2 this morning, chapter 2. And Jesus, this is the third day of Jesus' ministry and his public ministry, in fact. And he and the disciples and his mama, they've been invited to a wedding. And some of you know the story, the wedding at Cana. And so that's where we are, the first 12 verses of chapter 2 this morning. Here's what it says. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And his mother said to his servants, do whatever he tells you. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it, and when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed him. And manifested his glory, and his disciples believed him. Now, some of you have been waiting for this passage because some of you are like, man, we're going to figure out how he deals with alcohol here, and some of you are going, man, I can't wait till, he approves it or he throws it down and explains it. And that has nothing to do with this passage. Okay? But let me tell you what this passage does have to do with. Running out of wine is a big deal in that culture. It could have been food. It could have been some other things, because the role of the bridegroom was to provide the most hospitable experience for his guest that he could possibly provide. And for him to potentially run out of wine would have been the most insulting thing to his guests. On the most important day of his life, and an incredibly important day in the life of the community of that village, had he run out of wine or food or whatever it may have been that day, it would have been like disinviting the whole community, saying, you're not that important to where I would provide all of this for you. Well, see, Jesus' mom knew this. I mean, she'd been to a bunch of weddings before. I don't know, maybe she was hoping Jesus would get married at some point. But she had been to a ton of weddings before, and she knew that this was going to be a problem if the wine ran out. So she goes to, her son, who happens to be the son also, and she says, hey, I need you to take care of this problem. They're about to run out of wine. And he says, woman, this has nothing to do with me. My time isn't yet come. Now, some of you are like, man, was he being sassy with his mama? And no. He actually uses almost that exact same phrase when he is dying on the cross and he's comforting his mother. Culturally, he was honoring her, and he's saying, listen, I'll do what you say, but I don't think it's time yet. But out of submission to earthly authority, not just because he's the son, but a son, he does what his mom says. And so she looks at some guys and says, just do whatever my son says. And he asks those servants, hey, go fill up those purification jars. I can get back to that because that's important. Those purification jars, a piece, 6 of them, 180 gallons, go fill all of that up with water. And then go pour a cup, take it to the master of ceremonies, he was the wedding planner, and take it to him and see what he has to say. And they take it to him, and he is astonished. And he says, normally, you serve all the good wine on the front end of things, and then the poor wine on the back end of things, but you have not only served good wine, you have served the best wine at the end. Oh, how you, bridegroom, have honored all of the guests. Now, there's some people that were watching this. Of course, the disciples, they're eavesdropping this whole time. They're watching what Jesus is doing. And what does it say? That he manifests his glory, and they believe in him. Day 3. He manifests his glory, and they believe in him. Well, there's some amazing things that we see here. I mean, we see the generosity of Jesus in so many extraordinary ways here, how he is caring for people. He's caring for a community. He's caring for a bridegroom. He also, we see that he takes the ordinary, like water, and he, water, H2O, has its own properties, and he turns it into something completely different. There's something extraordinary, something supernatural about that. Now, I need you to understand that anytime Jesus is working around his disciples, there's 2 things that are always happening. One, he is always expressing his glory. And here he's expressing his glory. I mean, he's doing things, they had never seen anybody change water into wine. He's expressing his glory. But he's also always teaching them what it looks like to be a disciple. And as we read Scripture, we ought to look at this in the same type of way. That the Word of God is always expressing his glory. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But it's also teaching us what it looks like to walk as a disciple. So just, the question this morning that I want to answer is how does Jesus manifest his glory in this wedding? And there's multiple ways, but let me just give you 2 today. First thing is this: he chooses hospitality. Jesus, one of the ways he manifests his glory is he chooses hospitality. He expresses hospitality. Now, hospitality is one of those things that is at the core of the gospel. But for you and I, let's think about hospitality for a second. I mean, what ultimately is hospitality? It's how you give attention to people, right? I mean, simply stated, it's how you give attention to people. It's how you listen to people. It's how you care for people. It's how you serve people. It's how you love people who are undeserving of your love. It's how maybe you forgive people who have wronged you. It's how you express mercy and grace to people. That's the essence of hospitality. Is it inviting people into your home and into your space? Is it inviting them into lunch at work? Is it caring for them as they have a need in your neighborhood? Absolutely. But it's also the expression of grace at its very core. And think about how God did that toward humanity. Again, what is John 1:14 saying? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Like the creator of the universe, according to Colossians 1, Jesus is the one who created all things, comes to earth, and now he becomes the host to a bunch of sinful people, cares for them, listens to them, loves them, redeems them, longs to restore them. I mean, this is an extraordinary act of hospitality because Jesus sees people running. The Father saw people running. That's why he sent his son Jesus to earth. He recognized that there is a battle that is always being waged. This is true for you and me. There's a battle that's always being waged inside of you, and it is a battle for your heart. And the enemy is using every form of seduction, every threat to divide your heart, to take it captive. And Jesus, on the other hand, is wanting to invite you to this place of peace, this place of satisfaction, this place of single-mindedness and single-heartedness. That's why King David in Psalm 86:11, he says, give me an undivided heart. I want to know your ways. I want to walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart. Because you want to experience that peace, that satisfaction, because he knew that there was a war going on in his heart. And here Jesus, in a subtle way, is expressing a gospel to these party guests who have that war going on in their heart. Now, 3 years from now, those people that are attending this wedding, many of them may see a different expression of hospitality that ends up hanging from a cross, where he gives them a gift that they could never purchase themselves, a gift that they could never earn out of their own goodness or out of their own justice. He'd give them the gift of forgiveness. And we talk about hospitality. The gift of forgiveness allows them to know a loving and holy Creator. But not only is Jesus expressing hospitality here, but he's also giving them a picture that their rituals are inadequate. That we have this tendency, I mean, from the moment that sin entered the world, we've been wired in such a way where we think that if we just do something for God, we can get something out of God. That essentially we try to leverage God for certain things. We try to manipulate God for certain things. And listen, we do this all the time. You may not be able to say amen. Maybe you have to say ouch, but we do this all the time. I mean, think about it. There are moments in our life where we say, Lord, you know, I've been asking this from you for days. I've been praying to you for days. I've been trusting you for days. I've given you the glory in this instant, and I'm just waiting for you to do this. God, why haven't you done this? And by the way, he's okay with our honesty. He loves our honesty. You'd be in good company with other biblical figures. But he wants our heart to say, Jesus, whatever you have for me, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to be satisfied in you. There's no ritual that you can do in order to garner the favor of God. And it's no mistake that he's talking about, John here is pointing to the fact that he was using these Jewish jars of purification. I mean, there was a water ceremony that was part of this old covenant. You know, if you do this, you'll get this type of covenant. But here's the thing, now that Jesus is here, things have changed. And Jesus is making that clear in a very subtle way. The water ceremony has now been replaced with something far greater. The external purification of good works and sacrifices and other things has given way to an internal cleansing where Jesus alone is the sacrifice. And there's a promise, there's also an eternal one about that. When we talk about hospitality. And here Jesus, in a very subtle way, is expressing the gospel through his hospitality. What does that look like in your life? You know, some of you are like, man, I don't know how. There's some guys that I know, man, they can go and share the gospel with a tree stump, and that tree stump will be redeemed. I mean, it's amazing. They have a unique gift and a unique calling, and but we're all to express the gospel. And one of the ways that we can do that is through hospitality. One of the ways that this is how Jesus started his public ministry, was expressing hospitality. So what does that look like as you're engaging, as you're listening, as you're loving, as you're serving, as you're caring for your community, as you're caring for your neighborhood, for your coworkers? What does that look like as you invite them into your space, as you gently invite yourself maybe into theirs? As you care for them, as you love them, as you express mercy to them, as you express grace to them. And know that as you express gospel hospitality, you're giving them a taste of who Jesus is. So Mary goes to her son, says, hey, we got to fix this. Would you do something about it? And Jesus does. And you know, one of the things that I think is extraordinary about this, I don't want it to get lost because it's a massive point, is that had the bridegroom run out of wine, he would have been shamed for years. He would have been shamed for years. And one of the things I just love, it's so subtle in this passage, is that Jesus saved him from shame. And that is just his standard. When we choose to put our hope in him, find our satisfaction in him, Jesus saves us from shame. So one of the ways he manifests his glory is through hospitality. But the other one, again, is through the supernatural. He does a miracle. And this is where it says the disciples believed. But let me go back to that first set of questions I was just asking you earlier. I mean, where do we go when we have a need? I mean, ultimately, we spent some time praying this morning, but where do we go when we have a need? Are we in awe of ourselves and the ways of humanity, or are we in awe of God and we run to him? Because times of pressure always reveal not only who we are, but where we go for comfort, where we go for security, where we go, where our hopes are set. You know, if you've been following news, or maybe particularly sports news this week, there's a gentleman, Damar Hamlin, who was a defensive back for the Buffalo Bills. And earlier this week in the Bills-Cincinnati football game, he had a cardiac arrest on the field. It was crazy. I mean, that never happens. These are premier athletes. And he has cardiac arrest right there on the field. I mean, they're doing CPR. People are panicking. Now, thankfully, by the grace of God, he is recovering. He's doing really well, all things considered. But you begin to see what people believe really quickly. And there's kind of two different things that you see throughout the week. You see one group of people saying, oh man, we've got to pray. And that was a beautiful thing that you begin to see people gathering and praying. You see sports anchors that are getting bold all of a sudden online, and they're talking about who Jesus is. And they're saying, you know what? I know this is ESPN, but I'm just going to stop and pray. And I love that, right? But you also see people going, man, humanity is strong. He's going to push through. And we look to human nature and whatever goodness we might be able to perceive about it, and we lift that up as high as we can. And you see these two different things competing. You know, the awe of man and what man can do in his strength and in his power. And, man, he pulled through by his own strength and power. Or the awe of God. The one who actually holds all things together. Right? And here's the treacherous and deceitful thing about human nature. is that when we find ourselves in those spaces, when we find ourselves in deep need of something, this is where the test comes. This is where the test is. This is where we either turn to human nature and we find our all and attempt to find our satisfaction there, or we turn to a loving Creator. And here's what often happens. If we turn to human nature, we end up wandering off to a place where we ultimately just find ourselves with more need, more suffering, and more pain. Even my devotion this morning when I was reading through Psalm 16:4 says, the sorrows of those who run after another God will only multiply. If we just run after another God, if we run after another idol, our need only multiplies. We're either in awe of God or we're in awe of ourselves and human nature. John Wesley Powell was the first guy to make that descent into the Colorado River Basin in the Grand Canyon in 1869. And he had no idea what was ahead of him, but he had a crew with him. But there was all sorts of different challenges, from rapids, unexpected falls, to water that was just devouring the wooden boats that they came into. And so a few weeks into this, there was a number of his crew that were like, we're done, we're out. And they were starting to mutiny this. And Powell said, hey, listen, don't go off on your own. We got to follow the Colorado River. Don't try to cut back through the canyon and find something. And against all warning, what happens? Well, those guys mutinied. And they decided to try to take a trip through the canyon rather than following the river. And we've never heard from those guys again. See, in our longing to have our needs met, we will either be lured by an enemy that wants us to operate in our own strength, our own power, only to take us captive and bring desolation into our life, or we're going to allow Jesus to be the one that speaks into that. We say, Jesus, I know that you alone can speak into my hurt, my pain, my need, my crisis. Now, you may be thinking, gosh, we went from water to wine to complex stuff. I know I can't turn water into wine, but that's pretty simple in comparison to the complex stuff that's going on in my life. And some of you may be thinking, Pastor, if you just knew what was going on in my family, if you knew about my child, if you knew about the addiction that I've been trying to cut. I'm not going to tell anybody about it because I'm pretty sure I have the discipline in order to knock it out. But if you knew about the addiction, I'm not sure that it meets the standard of what God can actually do. Water to wine, but I got cancer. I don't have cancer, but you may have a sickness. You may be thinking, how is he gonna address this sickness in my life? How's he going to address the abuse that I experienced for 20 years in my life? How's he going to bring that long time ago friendship that now just needs restoration? How's he going to minister to my spouse? Water to wine. Psh, but do you understand the complexities of what I'm going through? And Jesus would say, yeah. Man, if you would trust me in turning water to wine, those simple things that I can do supernaturally, you got to trust me in the complex as well. That I want all of you. I want all of you. And I want you to know me, Jesus would say. I want you to know me in the most satisfying of ways. That all of your security would be found in me. All of your comfort would be found in me. All of your hopes and dreams, well, they wouldn't be set in something else, but they would be found in me. And that when you have that need, when the pressure is on, when that crisis comes, you say, Jesus, would you come and speak into that? God wants you to run to him for that miracle, for his power. Again, what you believe is revealed in the time of need, crisis, or pressure, right? You know, as I don't dwell on the pandemic, but I spent some time thinking about the last couple years over the break, and I just thought, man, the pandemic is one thing, the post-traumatic stress that is a result of the pandemic that we kind of live in now that nobody wants to talk about is another. But one of the things that, I think the pandemic conditioned us to do is to look for the normal or for the good rather than for the power of God. And I think that's a trap. One, normal, that's a dumb term. And quite frankly, if we think the last 100 years in America is what's normal, I would tell you that's abnormal. Like there's no other country in the world, in world history, that has experienced the type of prosperity that has gone on in the last hundreds of years. That is abnormal. What's normal is what we see in the Bible and what we see in the rest of the world where there's chaos, where there's craziness. That's normal. And so if we're looking for the comfort of what is quote-unquote normal for us, man, that's a trap. And what I know to be true is that the longing for things just to be good again, that's a runway for us to compromise. It's a runway for us to just become more self-reliant in the things that we've created rather than in the ways of God and His power. And when we look at this story here in Cana, we see Jesus who took something physical and He did something supernatural in the midst of a crazy period of time. When somebody had a need, he took physical problems, and physical problems are no match for God. He took something meant for one thing and He manifested Himself in it another way. So do you have an awe for God? Or is there more of an awe of self? Does your independence get in the way of seeing Jesus as supernatural? Does your independence get in the way of seeing Jesus as supernatural? You know, for some of us, we think that our crisis or the pressure that we're feeling or our need is in the way of a productive life. It's in the way of us experiencing joy. And I need you to understand that our need is not in the way of any of those things. Rather, it's our delusions of our independent strength that get in the way. The fact of the matter is that there's not a day that goes by that we aren't weak, that we don't need Jesus. Rather, what we need to do is admit that we are weak. And when we begin to admit that we are weak, that actually becomes a protective measure. Not only is it a sign of maturity in a disciple's life, but it's a protective measure because it protects us from the dangers of all the self-righteousness that we tend to try to leverage as if we did something, or that self-reliance, so that we walk in our own power. Some of you may know the name Harry Houdini. He became pretty famous because he was able to get out of handcuffs and jail cells and other contraptions that tried to keep him confined. And there's some really unique stories. He certainly was a talented guy that could get out of a lot of things. But one day he was boasting quite a bit to a bunch of police officers that he could get out of any lock. He could pick any lock and get out of it. So the officers were like, man, we've seen you do this 100 times. Wouldn't it be fun? Come on down to the station. We'll put you in a jail cell and we'll see what you can do. So they put him in the cell. They closed the door behind him, and he immediately pulled from his belt this thin and strong piece of metal, and he began to work the lock. And he just kept working it, but the lock would never yield. So 2 hours later, with all of his power and intuition and strength and everything else, he calls the officers in. He cries, "Uncle, I'm done. I can't get it up." Everybody's perplexed. Again, the officers knew his, who he was and what he had done. Some of them had even seen him perform at points, and everybody was perplexed. But here's what had happened. The guards had forgotten to lock the cell door. So all he had to do was just walk through the door. He didn't have to expend any energy. He had nothing to offer, quite frankly. All he had to do was walk through the door. Sound familiar? We try to do things in our own power over and over again. All the while, Jesus is saying, man, would you just let me empower you? Trust in me. Let me be your satisfaction. Let me be the one who speaks into your need, into your pain, into your celebration, into your shame. So what does it look like? What happens if we have this awe of God? I mean, how does that play out for us? Well, let me just offer a few things. You know, when we experience the awe of God, rather than the awe of self, the first thing that begins to happen in our life is there is a heart of humility. There's a heart of humility. Listen, there is nothing that will speak to our distorted situation or will yank us out of functional arrogance than standing before an awesome God. And when we recognize who Jesus is and the fullness of his greatness and awe, if we meditate on those things, if we constantly are mindful of who he is, and there's going to be a humility, a healthy humility that's going to be cultivated in your heart. Listen, comparing, as long as you're comparing yourself with other people, you're going to always find somebody whose existence is an argument for your righteousness. You just will. That's called self-righteousness. That's called pride. But when we measure ourselves up against the greatness of God, it produces and cultivates humility in our heart. That's worship. Second thing is when you have an awe of God, it creates a tenderness in you. It creates a tenderness in you. No one gives grace better than the person who's been deeply persuaded by the fact that he needs it himself and he's received it himself. Right? The person who is often most gracious is the one who has experienced the most grace. And there's a tenderness that comes out of that when we experience the awe of God. You want to talk about hospitality and an expression of that? Have a heart that is humble and tender. The awe of God's going to produce a passion in you. A passion in you that where your joy isn't handcuffed by circumstances. It's not handcuffed by relationships, but you have a joy because you are a child of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You're going to have a confidence. And I hope you get that nobody has more zeal for his own glory than God does. But that's a good thing because he wants everything to be good. He wants you to experience his goodness. So there's a healthy confidence when we recognize the awe of God. There's a healthy confidence that is produced in us because we trust in his power rather than our own. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, in such a world where everything is so fast and quick and we're told you got to run this race, is that when you experience the awe of God, you begin to experience rest. You begin to experience rest. Because you know that there is nothing too hard for God. That he can meet you right where you are. So as you look back at 2022, and maybe some of the frustrations, thoughts, and wishes that you had as you look toward 2023, go, man, I want this to change in my life. I want God to meet me here. You're asking God for something big this year. And man, you ought to be asking God for something big this year. That would just be a good thing. Ask God for something big this year. Would you step into his power? As you step into his presence, you're stepping into his power. You allow him to speak into those needs, those desires, those pressure points, those circumstances. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for the gracious way that you come in a time of celebration and a time of joy, and you continue to meet our needs even when we don't know it. Bridegroom had no idea. And yet you saved him from shame and heartache. You demonstrated to a lost people what it looks like to care well. You need to do the supernatural. So Lord, if some of us just need to confess this morning that maybe we've been living in the awe of ourself, or in the awe of our culture, or in the awe of another person, or in the awe of something on the internet, or human intuition, or whatever that is, Lord, would your hand of conviction break that down, where we would come to you with all that is reserved for you and you alone. That we would come with humility and tenderness, that we would allow you to direct our passion, that our confidence wouldn't be born out of our own reliance or even what we see somewhere else, but that it would be born out of what we know you're about and who you are. And we just rest in that. In your name, amen. We're going to sing here in a second. Let me invite you to respond.